Welcome to Life Chapters Money Choices, the podcast that explores the various transitions of our lives and those little money decisions that affect them, that sometimes become bigger money decisions. And I think we often imagine financial planning as something that's quite neat and orderly, with things like retirement dates and savings plans and investment portfolios that are all ticking along in the background. But as we know, life is a habit of interrupting those best laid plans. And I think one of the most emotionally complex transitions that many families face is the moment when adult children begin caring for aging parents. Not just emotionally, but I think financially and legally too. And the roles kind of reverse. The people who once guided our decisions now depend on us to help manage theirs. And somewhere in that process, we've got a tool that often enters the conversation called power of attorney. I'm sure we've all heard of it being bandied about, but what does it actually mean? Because the importance of understanding this really will shape what happens next, who makes the decisions, how we make the decisions, and most importantly, how families prepare for a crisis before it arrives, because so often we only start preparing after the crisis. So to help unpack this incredibly important and I think often misunderstood topic, we're joined by James Carvalho, who's a director and financial planning specialist at Chartered Chartered Wealth Solutions. I'm going to say Chartered Financial Wealth, Chartered Wealth Solutions. James, welcome.
Thank you.
And in studio as always, Kim Potgieter, to help us guide not just the financial choices, but the psychological and emotional decisions we make along the way as well. Kim, you're looking good.
Thanks, Michael. Good to be here.
Now, Kim, this is one of those life chapters that almost nobody plans for, I think, emotionally. It is one of those like, I'll never get cancer. We just never talk about it, and we prepare for everything else. So I guess the question is, let's start with that emotional transition. When adult children suddenly find themselves responsible for their parents' affairs, and I'm no stranger to this in that I'm part of the sandwich generation, so I've had to look after my mom financially, but it's nothing that anything could have ever prepared me for. So what tends to be the biggest emotional shock?
I think for us as children, and I'll talk about from the children's perspective, it's, as you're saying, that different position. Now, our parents are people we have to look after. So we have to come to terms with that first. And then I think the hardest thing that happens, Michael, is that first conversation with your parents. Because remembering, especially if somebody is not of sound mind, or they're starting with a little bit of dementia, they fight you in the beginning. So it's not like you go in and say, well, Mom and Dad, I want to help you. And they go, wow, thank you, Kim. I'm so excited that you want to help me. They go, absolutely not. What are you doing? And actually the anger that comes out at those times is really, really difficult. So you're trying to help, but at the same time, you got parents from a point of view disagreeing with you, but also the respect comes in. Now they're your parents, now you're not showing respect to them. So it's a very complex time, and I would say it's the most complex from the emotional point of view, because all of a sudden your roles are changing and no one's ready for it ever.
And that's the thing. Even if you do plan, I don't think you'll ever be ready for that moment when you're confronted by it. And I mean, one can understand the reasons, that loss of independence. I could put myself in my mom's shoes, for example, and you push back against it.
And you're proud.
And you're proud. And, your identity has been so much about being the carer, not the cared for. And so when you work with families, do these conversations, obviously they don't happen early enough, but when should they be starting to sit down and have these conversations to ensure that they try and tackle these things and be a bit more proactive?
So again, it's just like, when should we start investing? Oh, we should start when we're 18.
Yeah.
I think this is the same kind of thing. There are two topics that clients don't like to talk to us about when they come in to plan their next chapter, their retirement. The one is retirement lifestyle villages, estates. They don't want to talk about that. They're never going to have to go there. And then the second one is what when they're not capable of looking after their own money. So for us, and the way we work at Chartered, is really to have those conversations very early on. Because again, I think I've shared many times with you, Michael, we use stories. We use stories of other people, so we don't make it about them. So when we're sharing the story, this will come. There are two different phases to retirement. Different things happen. But if we have it all in writing, we have it all in a discussion, in a conversation, we bring in adult children into those discussions, it can be way better received than when we come and our client, all of a sudden we notice, so this often happens, we notice that something's not going so well. We then contact the children, the adult children, and then all of a sudden, where does this line sit of what we're allowed to tell the children, what we're not allowed to tell the children? And at the same time, sometimes if the children don't know to contact us, they might be noticing things. So it's very important that we as a business get involved with the whole family and not just the couple through these financial planning discussions.
Yeah, I mean, it must place you in a very invidious situation. James, talk to me about your experience about, when you've had to deal with this before we get into the minutiae of power of attorney.
Yeah, Michael, I think the challenge with this is sometimes we don't have the luxury of children being in South Africa. A lot of our client base live in South Africa. So as much as Kim alludes to children, the grey area is when there's no kids. And then you're left with the surviving spouse to pick up the pieces. And that's where it's almost a blinkered, well, I don't want to go there because there's no ways my husband or my wife is going to have dementia. So then it becomes even more tricky. So you kind of land with a no man's land. Where do you go from there? Because no one wants to think about their significant other with dementia. Yeah. And that's the trickier part, because the master wants substance here. He's looking for family members that can present themselves, present accounts, do annual reports. But what do you do then? And that's the trickier conversation what Kim was talking about.
And as we know, I mean, let's not even go into the mess that the master's office is in at the best of times. So you have to have absolutely every single I dotted and T crossed when it comes to these things. James, I think many people assume that a power of attorney will solve everything if a parent or a partner becomes incapable of managing their affairs. So let's just start with the basics, because I think sometimes that's also maybe an overblown assumption. What exactly is a power of attorney, and what does it allow someone to do on behalf of another person?
So in South Africa, we have the general power of attorney, and that really stands up well if you have got signing powers on someone's investment, for example. They fall and break their hand and they can't sign a document, or in hospital for a normal procedure other than something that renders them incapable of actually withdrawing it. If you can't withdraw your own power of attorney, it potentially means that you've lost your faculties, you are not in a position to think about things, and that then becomes null and void. So if you can't retract your own power of attorney, the power of attorney becomes naturally null and void. Unlike in America and the UK, we have what's called an enduring power of attorney, which lasts all the way through your life, regardless of whether you've got dementia or not. In South Africa, we don't have that luxury.
That's fascinating, because I always assumed if you've signed a power of attorney before you get dementia, that it will be enduring. Yeah. But quite clearly it isn't.
No, so it's the minute you can't retract it yourself, that becomes null and void.
So what does someone do in that situation?
Well, that's the tricky part, because in most of these cases, what you're trying to do for clients is look after their financial well-being, right? So the mental well-being is one side, but the financial well-being is the other. Banks won't even operate on a general power of attorney even when you haven't lost your mind, because they require their own power of attorneys, okay? So not only the general power of attorney works for us in a normal environment, but you also need to do it at a bank. So it's the financial consideration we're trying to get right.
And quite clearly, that requires a much more detailed plan and consideration in the event that the worst case scenario happens. So what does one start thinking of doing from a financial planning perspective here before we come back to some of the emotional and psychological impacts?
And it goes down back to the estate planning conversations. The estate planning conversations always is to try and equalize the playing fields where you can between spouses. There's no donations tax between spouse. So the best thing to do is try and equalize the playing field from an asset point of view, that you're covering each other. God forbid something happens to the one, well, guess what? I'm okay. I've got some money. Traditionally in South Africa, we've seen the CEO male come out of a corporate life, hold into all the assets. The spouse who raised the child at home has got nothing. And not only from a death perspective, but from this perspective, perspective, that particular person is left now wanting for money. So we try and do that in the estate planning conversations, going back to what Kim was talking about earlier.
And what's important to get right in that particular conversation, Kim? Because again, it's a very loaded conversation, or potentially could be if you're coming from asymmetrical positions of perceived power and contribution to a relationship.
Well, what we're doing there is we are now challenging the way they've run their entire lives, where one party has taken care of the other person. And it isn't an easy one. And sometimes it's a little bit around trust, because remember, again, ego is always in these conversations, but I'm so good at it. I know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing. So it's again, when is that line of the day that we know we don't know what we're doing? And that's where it becomes really difficult. And then on top of that, Michael, you get the partner going, no, sure, I don't want this responsibility. I don't want to have to do all of this. This is not my area of expertise. And that's why often for us, just coming in as that neutral, objective person, that at least they both know we are there. If we have to assist the one that doesn't know a lot about financial planning, then they at least know that they've got this person that they've chosen together to do it. And then for the other person, they can release a little bit through the years. They release a little bit of that, okay, I trust you. You can do it. I know you've got our best interests at heart. So it is a work in progress, and it is just an open discussion. I mean, I go back to it when somebody phones me and says they're coming in, and James does exactly the same. We say, would you bring your partner in? And then often they'll say, but I don't need to bring my partner in. My partner really doesn't get involved in the financial side.
Yeah.
And you can't say to somebody, because then it's like fear selling. Well, what when this happened? What when this happened? What when this happens?
And then you just sound like a life insurance salesman.
Exactly.
Right.
That's not
exactly
what we're
right.
trying to do. We're trying to safeguard and keep this family in their place that they deserve to be. But sometimes it does sound like we're doing that fear selling thing, which we don't want to be seen as those kind of people.
No, but you've got to be realistic. You've got to be pragmatic. And there is that delicate balancing act. I do think it also comes back down to earlier conversations we've just had around, what it is you're trying to build with your partner through a shared life, and why it is so much more than just money. Because money is one of these things that is the enabler, but it can be in a situation where someone is left incapacitated, something that leaves a huge burden on the surviving children, spouse, whatever it is. And that's not just being a fear merchant. That's just reality. That's life.
That's right.
Which I think it's so strange to me, James, that in other jurisdictions we have enduring power of attorney. Why does South Africa not currently recognise this? I believe the Law Reform Commission has actually looked at this and thought, well, this is unusual, because to me, how do you know where that grey line is when you stop having the faculties to choose? So is this something that the law just hasn't kept up with that could change in the future? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think, unfortunately, it goes to the negative. But, if you have an enduring power of attorney, you don't know the abuse in it. If you think about when someone gets dementia, and if you think about the unscrupulous adventure of people, what that could do to people's finances if they are not regulated correctly. I mean, we don't know that people wouldn't stand outside, retirement villages and pretend to be the best estate planner with enduring power of attorney, and I'll look after your money, right? So then you'll end up giving your money to complete strangers. So absurdly enough, I think the law's done well to protect people. So that's why, I think South Africa is a highly regulated place, and I actually appreciate the law in that regard, because I'm not sure how many people would get abused in the enduring power of attorney. Yes, it's utopia, and it would look great, and we wouldn't have to go through this no man's land while we apply for administration, but you've got to consider the other side. And I'm not sure what that would look like either.
Yeah.
Maybe even worse.
Yeah, maybe 6 of one, half a dozen of the
100%.
other, as you say. Kim, what are your thoughts on it? Because, do you see any momentum to change the law as it currently stands?
As James is saying, he's talking about unscrupulous people that would do that to you, but we also see it just within family members. So when you give the power of attorney to one person, say you give it to one of your children, but not to the others, it's incredible how we see it happen, where other children who haven't got it then start second guessing their sibling. And they go, well, I don't know if they've really got the best interest at heart. I think they're doing it for themselves. And then all of a sudden we get these dynamics in families where families are upset with each other. So it is so complex because we're dealing with money. It's so complex because it's people. And I think, I wouldn't want to, I'm not a lawyer. James is not a lawyer. We're just working with the law and within it. And from our point of view, we have seen, and there are ways around this, which we'll talk about, we have seen that people are being safeguarded. And that is so important because at the end of the day, what we don't want is a whole lot of people losing their money because they trusted somebody. And this is what happens, and we see it often with our clients where their partner passes away. They get somebody new into their life. They're vulnerable. They're incredibly vulnerable because they've gone through this biggest loss that they've got and they're grieving. And they meet people who present themselves as having their best intentions. And this is where it gets so complex.
Well, listen, we've just seen, and I'm not going to mention names here, but Ponzi schemes in the Johannesburg community where individuals who are supposedly friends were defrauded of millions of rands. This is the reality. Let's come back to the nuts and bolts of things, James. If a parent becomes mentally incapacitated and the POA lapses, what actually happens next?
Well, it's a tricky one because you kind of need to work out what their financial situation is. So if you've done really great estate planning and you are blessed with equal assets, then potentially what you can do is guide the family to pick up the pieces with the surviving spouse's assets. So you create these income plans with the survivor. However, the grey part is that most of our the way you approve investments, the way you approve withdrawals are all done via OTP. So I always say to the family, make sure you keep your cell phones active. Okay, so the MTNs and Vodacoms recycle your numbers every 3 months. If you haven't used your phone, keep it active. If you're trying to keep up a regular withdrawal and investment that's funding the household income, well, the surviving spouse can still use that one-time password and cell phone to validate while you potentially go through the administration process if that's what you need to go through. It depends on the severity, etc. So it's very important practically to make sure that you can still validate through emails, one-time passwords while you're talking to your financial planner and working out what the next steps are going to be.
I think that's a really interesting bit of insight and advice there. When it comes to who actually determines mental incapacity legally, we're not lawyers, but is it a medical determination? Is that a grey area?
No, it's a medical determination. You need to have a physician. A physician will sign off your form of dementia, whether it's stroke dementia or Alzheimer's, whatever the case may be. You cannot validate yourself. I've seen it with my clients. I can see the signs.
And my partner can't just walk in and say, Michael's batshit crazy.
No, it has to be certified, unfortunately, before you can even go down the roads of even thinking about things like administration, which is tough for financial planners because you can see it happening, right? But there's not a lot you can do with it.
Yeah, and I think at that point, families often hear about administration under the Mental Health Care Act, I think, if I'm not mistaken. That's so right. What does that process involve?
Yeah, so it's a formal process. I think for smaller estates, you can go through the master instead of the High Court. For bigger states, potentially what you're going to have to go through is curator bonus. This is a professional organisation that manages affairs, but if we talk about the administration, it's generally a surviving spouse if they've got the capacity, or children if you're lucky enough for your kids to live here. It has to be investigated by a formal investigator. It'll come and my dad had dementia. They sent an investigator. They sat with my mom and I. They tried to talk to my dad. My dad, unfortunately, had stroke dementia, so he couldn't actually communicate well enough. But after the fact, the investigator then submits a report to the master and says that he agrees that with the administration, he's checked the accounts, he's checked that I'm a valid person in South Africa, I've got a job, and all those good things. So, there's a bit of a process, and it can take between 6 and 9 months. You get an interim administration kind of certificate, but it takes about 6 months before you get a final administration certificate, which then you have to bond. So I had to go to get insurance for it's kind of $100,000 for R1,000,000 and has to be paid every year. And that can also be expensive for smaller estates. So it's not a cheap exercise in any form, even if you go the curator bonus or not.
Yeah, that's where theory meets real life. While families are waiting for administration or curatorship to be approved, bills have to be paid, accounts to manage, all of that. And I'm very sorry to hear that you've had to endure that, James. But it's given you insight into the emotional and psychological tax that one has to pay through this process as well, and why you don't want to have to be managing all of the minutiae, and hopefully have that sorted out up front if you can. What are some practical steps? I mean, I love that maintaining cell phone access. So what are some other practical steps? I think when it obviously comes to online banking, I suppose one should have some kind of master file somewhere for your surviving children or spouse to access.
That's it. I think it's just passwords. I think even if you lose a banking password, right, what do you do to reset it? Well, the banking password goes to your cell phone, one-time password. So the cell phone is the key, because basically your banks use it, your investment platform providers use it, and that's where it starts. So if you've got the ability, because I mean it's emotional time, right? Your spouse makes a mistake on the computer or on a banking site. That's kind of where it all starts. So keep that one-time password open with your cell phone, and you'll be okay. Yeah.
Kim, what are the conversations that families should ideally be having before the mental incapacity arises, and how do you encourage a very difficult conversation to happen? I mean, there's no one size fits all.
I mean, James is probably the best one to answer it, since he went through it personally. I think when you're going through it personally, and that's what's incredible about us as a group of planners at Chartered, because we've all gone through something different with parents, with children. And then we come back and we spend time and we share it. Because when I go into a meeting now with somebody that might potentially have starting dementia, I've got James in the back of my head. I've got that conversation that he had with his parents, and how hard it was for him to bring it up with his parents. You remember how he felt so he's going through all these emotions, and his parents are going through it, and now he's got to be strong. And as he's saying, he's got to prove to the administration that he's of good caliber, that he can look after his parents' money, and at the same time, he's going through all these emotions of seeing his dad in that state. So again, and it's such a difficult one, because if you start it too early, people think you're weird. So when we do the estate planning meeting, we talk about not only death, we talk about things happening within it. And, just even our podcast is all about these different life transitions. And people think, oh, well, I'm retiring. That's my last transition I'm going to go through. And it's the furthest thing from the truth. There's just a whole lot of transitions that are coming. So, I mean, we're in a privileged position where we can sit with people and we can actually bring these things up. If you think about it, Michael, who can you bring them up with? It's very hard to bring them up within a family. I actually think it's one of the hardest things to bring it up within a family. Like, you don't want to talk to your friends about it because it's vulnerable. I mean, it's vulnerable even thinking we're getting old. I mean, we're all fighting this whole thing about it getting old. So who do you have to talk about it? And that's where our role is such a vital role, because we can sit in a neutral place and have these discussions. So as much as they're uncomfortable, we do bring them up. They're part of our process. And yes, we talk about getting the return on life and the best life that you can have, and doing all these incredible things off your bucket wheel. But at the same time, we're talking about the hard times, the challenges, and things that can potentially, wipe you out emotionally, financially, as a family.
It was very interesting. I think it was a couple of years ago, watching the Mouton family go through this in a very public fashion as well. But James, just to come back to your experience, and when you started to see the signs, is that when you first started approaching your parents? And do you have siblings that you then had to corral into this? To just share a little bit about what you've learned going through the process.
Well, before I get to that, Michael, I think going back to your conversation earlier, Kim, when you're talking to families, I think it's easier to share stories.
Yeah.
And with a sharing environment, it's not like, oh, wow, I see your spouse has got dementia. It's a bit like you know, let's talk about something softer. And these are the experiences we've seen. And you use stories. So I've been quite fortunate to use a story. My story was a little bit more stark than that because my dad didn't get dementia over time. He got stroke dementia. So that brought on the dementia immediately.
Yeah.
Where someone might, and I've seen it with clients, who you can start seeing the signs. They attend a meeting, they ask the same thing over and over again, or the significant other spouse says, well, just, bear with him or bear with her. He's not in a great place today. You can see the signs. So you can use softer stories to bring out things, to rather than going, oh, I see you've got dementia. Wow. Or the signs of, because you can't, actually, you're not a physician anyway. So I think the stories is the best way to talk about things. And that's for anything. That's financial planning, that's expense management, that's anything that we deal with. Relationships.
Yeah.
It's just using stories. It's a much softer way of getting through.
Yeah, I think it's a great bit of insight, and also why creating an environment where that storytelling is more natural and not something that feels imposed upon a family or a relationship is critical. And again, comes back to that planning together, doing these things together, involving the family when even it comes to putting maybe a family constitution or something like that together. I think so important, the role of communication. That's underpinned almost everything we've spoken about, Kim, in this podcast. Yet South Africans are notoriously poor at communicating around these kinds of issues.
Well, we all know we don't want to talk about money in the first place. And now we're having to talk about our vulnerability on top of that. And that's what makes it so difficult. Michael, just maybe one thing to add to this discussion, and it comes back to what James is giving us some tips to help you. But what I'm seeing a lot of clients do as well, and this is just across the board, where they're not keeping up to date with technology. And technology is moving at such a rapid pace at the moment. So for me, what I also always am encouraging, I do the learn section with people, is to go make sure that you're keeping up to date, that you have a banking app, that you know how to do emails, that you know how to sign with OTPs. Because when we meet them and they go, I'm not going to do it that way, I have to do the old-fashioned way, it's not happening anymore. And because it's changing. And then on top of it, what that's bringing in is it's bringing opportunities for fraud people and scam artists and everything like that to actually really take advantage of them. And it's just because they haven't kept up to date. So for me, it's quite a thing that I'm encouraging now. Whenever I come to the learn section of the Wheel of Balance, I go, well, what technology are you keeping up to date with? Because unfortunately, that all plays a part in all of this and in the management of it.
Yeah, and when we had Arthur Goldstuck on the show as well, just demonstrating that with AI, you're never too old to learn or to embrace new technologies, but also on the dark side of that, I interview so many people on radio around the increasing sophistication of social engineering attacks using artificial intelligence. You can clone a person's voice, put it into a WhatsApp message as a voice note, and all of a sudden you think you're dealing with someone that is quite close to you. Meanwhile, you've been completely spoofed. This is real, and you need to be aware of this, and you only do that by educating yourself and keeping up to date with technology. You don't have to be a self-imposed Luddite sometimes, as I think we like to be. James, just as before we wrap up, what advice would you give to families who know these conversations need to happen but haven't started them yet?
Well, I think you need to face the realities, and I think when people start seeing the signs, is not to ignore it. These are practical things that you have to face. It's part of reality. And unfortunately, we see a lot of it, right? So families need to be brave enough to actually face it and actually have those conversations with their financial planners and role play, and ask the financial planners to role play what if scenarios like we do for estate planning. Everyone focuses, one day when I pass away. Well, guess what? We're all going to pass away, but we don't know if we're going to get dementia. So it's really, really important that you've got a plan. And if you've got a plan, it takes all the anxiety away. It's not easy to deal with it anyway, but at least it can relieve some of the anxiety through the process. So find out what you can do practically with your financial planner.
Yeah, and nothing will prepare you for a moment like...
No, it won't.
A stroke, or my partner had a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis 7-8 years ago now, and that moment is kind of emblazoned in my mind's eye, and you're so emotionally fraught and fragile in that moment that it's so easy in hindsight to see how you could have been taken advantage of. Fortunately, it didn't happen that way, but one has to be prepared for these things. So, Kim?
So as you're saying, Michael, it doesn't only happen to us when we get older.
Yeah.
It can happen in our 40s, in our 50s, that these kind of situations happen. So we without being negative, I love what James said. Let's just prepare for the what ifs. If we can always talk about the what ifs, then we're prepared. So when they happen, it's not like this huge big shock. We're living till 100, so things have changed. If we were all, if that old life expectancy was in place, we wouldn't have to have all these what if conversations. But we are living longer and longer and longer. So just embrace them and rather have them prepared and planned, put away.
Yeah.
But you can refer back to them. So all of a sudden, as a family constitution, you've all had the discussions. You're in a better place, and there's no finger pointing. You said, I said, and then when those emotions come, and families then become totally dysfunctional, instead of the people that they need the most to come together to help them being able to do that.
Yeah, I think fantastic insights. And to both of you, thank you very much for demonstrating that, yes, a power of attorney can be an incredibly useful tool, but in South Africa, it's certainly not a complete solution. I think the real lesson from the conversation today is quite simple. Have the conversations. Conversations matter. And the earlier families have those difficult conversations about finances and legal authority and future care, all of those things, the more dignity and stability they can preserve when that difficult moment arrives, if or when it happens. Thank you very much, James Carvalho from Chartered Wealth Solutions, and of course to Kim Potgieter, as always, for reminding us that behind every financial decision is ultimately just a deeply human story. Well, you've been listening to Life Chapters Money Choices, the podcast about the moments when life changes and the money decisions that come with it. Until next time, I'm Michael Avery.